Prithvi Shantirantarikshagam Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantir Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the Divine Presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We begin today on verses 57 and 58. I think that's on probably page 33 of your book. Veenaya Rupa Saundaryam Tantri Vadana Saushthavam Pracharanjana Matram Tat Nasamrajyaya Kalpate Vagvaikhari Shabdachari Shastra Vyakhyan Kaushalam Vaidushyam Vidusham Tadvat Bhuktaye Natu Muktaye. The beauty of the veena and the expertise in playing it can only entertain people. These do not lead to an absolute supremacy over everything. In the same way, expertise in language, fluency in talk, proficiency in interpreting scriptures, and scholarship can only entertain scholars. These do not lead to spiritual freedom. And as you can see in the note there, veena is an Indian instrument. It's a string instrument, which is mentioned in the Vedas. So this can be a little confusing when you see, like, what does it mean? These do not lead to an absolute supremacy. The reason is that the word king in Sanskrit is called Raja, and the etymological meaning of the word king, how does the word Raja come in? That's the beauty of the Sanskrit language, is that the essential characteristics of most words can be known by just knowing how the word is derived, from which root it comes. So the word Raja, the king, it comes from Prakriti Ranjanat. So literally the word Raja means one who pleases the subjects in the kingdom. In other words, who is a good king? What we would say, who is a good leader? A good leader is one who does everything to fulfill the needs of those whom they are leading. And in the case of a king, it would mean a good king. An ideal king is one who leads in such a way that everyone under that king is happy. And so that's how this to an absolute supremacy comes, because simply by the translation, this doesn't kind of make too much sense. So what is being said here is that merely, and if someone is playing well on this musical instrument, and the instrument itself is beautiful, and your playing on that instrument is great as well. As a result of that, you are entertaining people. You are making people happy. But the literal meaning of the word king is one who makes people happy by fulfilling their needs. So what is being said here is, just merely by playing a musical instrument and making people happy, you are entertaining them, but that itself does not make you a Raja, doesn't make you a king. In the same way, and then the parallel, the idea being driven is, you might be expert in using words and language, you may be fluent in the way you talk, you may have a great proficiency in interpreting scriptures, you may have scholarship. Now all of these, you might be able to impress other people with all of that. You might be able to bring intellectual satisfaction to the people you speak with. But by this itself, this is not enough to give you spiritual freedom. So that's the meaning of an absolute supremacy. When I first read this verse, I had this question as well. Well, how does this beauty of the veena and expertise in playing, where does absolute supremacy come into it? And the connection is that just as an emperor has absolute supremacy over the people, and a good emperor is one who leads by making people happy, by fulfilling their needs. But merely by making people happy, one doesn't become an emperor. That's the way it is now. And you will see that the verses that we are studying, one of the themes that come, a recurring theme is, in this section, is that the externalities in spiritual life have value only insofar as they help us go inward. By themselves, these externals are not enough to give me freedom. So the idea is that the problem is ignorance. Knowledge alone can remove ignorance. If the problem is darkness, light alone can remove that darkness. Everything else that we do to bring light is helpful insofar as it helps me to bring light. But merely the activity itself is not enough. That's the idea. Look at verse 59. Avidnyate pare tattve shastradhitistu nishphala Vidnyate pare tattve shastradhitistu nishphala. The study of scriptures is useless if the highest truth is not known. The study of scriptures is useless also if the highest truth is known. So, like a Zen-like statement in some ways. Because right now we are studying a scripture and it just seems like, well, it is useless either way. The idea is this. If I spend my entire life studying scriptures, but I do so without remember we spoke earlier in this text about the 4 basic requirements. So if I do not make any effort to cultivate these 4 basic requirements, discernment, detachment, the quality necessary for spiritual life, the longing for freedom, if I don't have these, and I do not make any conscious effort to develop these, then I may study scriptures all my life, day and night, but they will not lead to freedom. So, if it doesn't lead me to freedom, then that study is pretty useless. I might as well have done something else in that time. And that is the meaning of the study of scriptures is useless if the highest truth is not known. Because again, as we said earlier, merely studying the scriptures, the truth cannot be known. The study of scriptures is beneficial if it is accompanied by the cultivation of those 4 basic requirements. alongside discernment, detachment, etc., if I study scriptures, then the scriptures become a great help in attaining that freedom. And that's why, without those things, if it doesn't lead me to freedom, then the study of scriptures is useless. Now, the second part, the study of scriptures is useless also if the highest truth is known. Now, this can be understood in two ways. And that is, once I have attained that truth, once I have become enlightened, then the scriptures are of no use to me. Sri Ramakrishna gives the example. He says, once you have to go and say, do groceries, and you have a bunch of things to get. And many of us, if there are not just one or two, if there are a number of things, we usually make a list so that we don't forget anything that is needed. So I go to the grocery store with my list, I check off all the items, get all the things, and once I have gotten all the things that were needed, I don't need that list anymore. The list is very useful before I get the things. Once I've gotten the things, the list is useless. I might as well throw it away. So if the purpose of study of scriptures is to get enlightenment, once I have gotten enlightenment, then the study of scriptures, I don't need it anymore. It will be, in fact, after that, if I still carry it with me, it might become a burden. It's like someone who is, this is just a theoretical possibility, if you like. Even after enlightenment, if someone wants to carry that, I've got the scripture, I know so. So the ego of studying the scriptures can be a big burden after the purpose is served. Now, of course, I said it's theoretical because if I've truly become enlightened, then I cannot have that ego. If I have to cross a lake or a river, if I want to go to the other side, and there is a boat there, and a rowboat, and I'm able to row, I get into that boat and go to the other side. That boat is useful because it helped me go to the other side. But once I have reached the other side, now if I say, oh my God, now how am I going to carry the boat? And I start carrying it over my head afterward, it's a burden. I don't need the boat after I have reached the other side. And that is why it is said, after the highest truth is known, the study of scriptures is useless. There's another meaning to the second part, and that is, the question comes, how vital is it to study the scriptures to become enlightened? Has everyone who has become enlightened, had they studied scriptures? And we cannot say that because we do see people, both in contemporary times as well as in history, who did not study any scriptures and they were enlightened. Well, Ramakrishna himself is the prime example of that. But there are also great mystics and saints in many traditions throughout history whom we don't see reading too many books. Some of them have not read any books at all, and yet they become enlightened. So it is possible for that knowledge to come even without reading any books. Now, because Vedanta accepts the possibility of rebirth in this relative reality, if someone shows this extraordinary maturity, spiritual maturity and understanding, even before they have done any formal study, one possible explanation for that is that maybe they have done all of this in their previous life. And that's how we read in the books. There was this great rishi called Vamadeva. It is said that as soon as he was born, from a very young age, he became enlightened. That doesn't make sense. This person didn't do any studies, didn't do any practice, and became enlightened. And because everything has a cause, and if the cause is not apparent in this life, then one reasonable conclusion is that maybe this person was already born with those samskaras. If it didn't come in this life, it came from the previous life. So that's the idea. So it's possible that some people become enlightened even without the study of scriptures. And for them too, that study is useless because the purpose has already been fulfilled. That's the idea. You can also say that suppose there's a lot of heavy rain and you have to go somewhere, and it starts raining when you are midway to that destination and there is nowhere to take shelter. And so you reach the destination and you're completely dripping wet. And after reaching that place, someone says, would you like to have an umbrella? Well, an umbrella is totally useless because I'm already wet. And suppose I'm going out and there is no rain, it's bright sunshine, and then the umbrella is useless also. This is kind of a parallel example from our day-to-day lives. Verse 60. Shabdajalam maharanyam chitta bhramanakaranam atah prayatnat jnatavyam tatvajñais tattvamatmanaha. The web of words is a huge forest which causes the mind to wander. Efforts therefore must be made by the wise to know the nature of the Atman. Some interesting analogy here. The web of words is a huge forest which causes the mind to wander. And this is very important for everyone, especially for us, now that we are studying this text. And this text has lots and lots of words. So it's very important not to get trapped in what this verse calls the web of words. Shabda jala. Jala is a web, and Shabda is a word. And not get lost in what is called the huge forest, Maha Aranya. We know that if we find ourselves deep inside a forest and you don't have your GPS, you don't have anything, then it's so easy to lose the sense of direction and not know how to navigate our way around these trees and trees. I mean, sometimes even if you go to some in a national forest or something and there are no road signs, or you go to some hiking trail and it gets dark and you do not know which way to go unless the directions are given clearly. So we know what it means to get lost. That thing can happen even when we are studying scriptures. Because here we are dealing with lots and lots of words. If we don't know the words, if we don't know the context, then we can get just lost into it. We might focus on what is not important and ignore what is important. So, what is important is to look at the meaning of the word, not the word itself. Yes, the words are important, but words, they should mean something. You know, if someone just comes and says some gibberish, that just sound, that just noise. Now, the word must mean something. Now, what happens in scriptures is that there are words, and when you read them, there is some meaning that comes to us. But it's good. You see, reading a scripture is different from reading a newspaper. That's why there are different kinds of reading. A newspaper is probably the most Well, very few people, I guess, today read newspapers in print with so much of online reading. But whether you read it online or on hard print, once you have read the news in a newspaper, it's of no value afterwards. You know the news. Then you don't go again deep into it and study it again and again. But the scripture is very different, because you read this and it makes some sense, but then you know that when you hold these words, these ideas into your heart for some time and start reflecting on it, then you begin to see the meaning that was not apparent in the first time. You dwell with it, hold on to it, maybe a day or 2 or weeks. You begin then to it's like entering inside a deep forest. And you're then able to see things which you may not have seen in the first reading. So, words are valuable insofar as they mean something. But what level of meaning becomes available to us depends on the state of our mind as well. That's why sometimes when we read these great books, the spiritual texts, you read something today, it'll convey some meaning. But you continue with your meditation, continue with your study, continue with your reflection, and then maybe you read the same thing after 6 months or a year, you will see something you hadn't seen before. And that's why a repeated study is always recommended. It's not enough only to hold on to the meaning of a word, because the word exists in a certain context. So you'll have to see what the context is. The context, and then we will be able to go in the right direction. Just as we might get lost inside a forest, if I know the meaning and I reflect on it and I see the context, then I get the direction of how to navigate my way through these forest of words. Now, the word Atman is a good example of that. We use the word Atman all the time, especially when we are discussing texts like these. And we often use the word Atman to mean the true self, the spiritual self. And we distinguish the Atman from the body, mind, ego, and so on. Now in Sanskrit, the word Atman simply means self, means me. And so in the Sanskrit text itself, the word Atman comes a lot more often than you read it in the translation. The reason is this. Depending on the context, sometimes the word Atman can mean the body, sometimes it can mean the mind, it can mean the ego, it can mean many things. Because in itself, the word Atman simply means self. And we could say, therefore, if we are speaking in Sanskrit, right now, my Atman is sitting here. Now, I know in English that doesn't make sense. But in Sanskrit, it means myself. I am sitting here. Now, the problem gets solved largely in translations because the translator then sees the context and translates the word Atman, which is in Sanskrit, appropriately into English. And that's why sometimes you will see the word body, mind, and so on. But oftentimes, that word in Sanskrit is just referred to as the Atman. And so seeing the context is very important. So that is what is meant by saying Shabda Jalam Maharanyam, the web of words and the huge forest. Once a great disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, his name was Swami Tyagananda, as a young man, many of these first generation of disciples, they were all young university students when they first came to Ramakrishna. So this young man, his name was Hari, he was greatly interested in studying scriptures from a very young age. And so, for an extended time, Ramakrishna didn't see him. He didn't visit for a long time. And then he asked some others and said, I don't see Hari nowadays. What happened? Is he okay? And then the others said, oh, Hari is busy studying scriptures, so he has no time to come see you. And so after Hari visited him after a considerable time, Ramakrishna gently asked him, how's your study going on? And then he said, what do all these books say? So many scriptures that you have studied. What is the gist that you get? Don't they all say, ultimately, that Brahman alone is real, that God is real, that everything else is transient? Now, once you have gotten that gist of what these books are trying to convey, why don't you now try to live according to that premise? As I said before, the goal is not simply to keep on reading and reading and reading and then feel good about it that I have read so many books. Have I got the essence of what these books are trying to convey? And having gotten that essence, I can ask myself, if this makes sense to me, if it resonates with me, then what am I doing to not just know the truth, but to live the truth? Not just have this as a kind of a cerebral, have it at the cerebral level, kind of something that stimulates me intellectually. But how can I live it in the sense, how does it influence the way I think, the way I speak, the way I relate myself to other people, the way I relate myself to the world, the way I move? How can my body, mind, my thinking, everything pulsates with this truth? If I believe that God exists, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be only from a non-dualistic standpoint. Even those of us who say, I believe in God, I have faith in God, God exists. What does living that truth mean? It means I never forget that God exists, if that's what I strongly believe. Not just when I'm in a place of worship, not simply when I'm meditating. Just as I never forget that I'm a human being, living the truth would mean never forgetting what I believe is my spiritual ideal. So that is what Ramakrishna told this young man, Hari. The result of studying the scriptures, if you have gotten that essence, then try to live according to it. Because ultimately, only what we are able to live becomes ours. What is simply an intellectual process, that is stored in the brain. And a brain is a part of this physical body. And at the end of this life, this physical body is going to perish, along with the brain. So all of the intellectual information I have accumulated in my brain is all going to go away. What will stick with me, what will stay with me, what death cannot erase, is what I have begun to live. It's not enough to know that being truthful is a great thing. But the question is, am I living truthfully? If I'm living truthfully, that will stay with me. Not simply the knowledge that it is good to be truthful. That's the idea. Verse 61. Ajnana sarpadashtasya brahma jnana aushadham vina kimu vedaischa shastraischa kimu mantraiv kimaushadhaihi. Without the medicine of the knowledge of Brahman, of what use are the Vedas, scriptures, mantras, and medicine to a person who is bitten by the snake of ignorance? Again, we see this idea being hammered in our minds, that ignorance is removed only through knowledge, not through anything else. Now, everything else, whether it is Vedas, scriptures, mantras, are useful only to the extent it can help generate knowledge. So their role is secondary. Knowledge is the primary source of freedom. Study of scriptures is great if it helps me in generating knowledge. And it will help me in generating knowledge if the study is accompanied by these 4 basic practices we studied earlier: discernment, detachment, the 6 treasures, and the longing for freedom. So the purpose of this, it's interesting that they mention the word Vedas, which is seen as a revealed text. So the purpose is not to denigrate the role of scriptures, but to point to the right way to study them. You see, even maps and almanacs have utility. We know that if you are going to a place we are not familiar with, having a map helps. But as they say, map is not the territory. If when during times of war, I might have the map of the enemy country, but just because I have the map with me doesn't mean I have conquered them. A map might be helpful in me finding my way to that place. So that's why the saying, a map is not the territory. Similarly with almanacs, there are these almanacs which have forecasts, not just a 10 days weather or a weeks long weather as some of our weather apps do, and they're pretty accurate. But the almanacs have a much long-term predictions about how the rainfall will be this year, and so on. So Ramakrishna used to say that an almanac might have these predictions about how much rain we can expect this season. But he said if you squeeze that almanac, not even a drop comes out. Again, the idea is the wisdom is there in scriptures, but merely taking a book and worshipping it, we are not going to make that wisdom our own just by worshipping the book. That's the idea. Verse 62. Nagacchati vinapanam vyadhiraushadha shabdatah vina aparokshanubhavam brahma shabdair namuchyate. Illness is not cured by hearing about medicine, but by drinking it. Freedom is not attained by hearing about Brahman, but by experiencing it. Again, you see the emphasis on experience. Swami Vivekachudamani used to say, religion is not simply believing in something, but religion is realization. Now, the times in which we live, it's not enough to say, everyone should be masked. Masking is important, but we should actually use a mask. Not just talking about the mask is going to protect us. That's the idea. So it's not just about expressing something, but actually doing it. Verse 63 and 64. Akritva drishya vilayam ajñātvā tattvamatmanah brahma shabdair kuto muktihi uktimatra phalair nridam. Akritva shatru samharam agatva akhila bhushriyam rajahamiti shabdanno raja bhavitum arhati. Without sublimating what is perceived And without knowing the true nature of the self, how can people attain spiritual freedom merely by uttering the word Brahman? Without conquering the enemies and without gaining enormous wealth, no one becomes a king merely by saying, I am the king. It's like if you want to fix yourself a cup of tea, go and fix yourself a cup of tea. Don't just sit in a place and say, tea, tea, tea. Clearly, no tea is going to come that way. So the right practice is necessary to remove ignorance. What do I mean by right practice? Remember, we often speak about the rope and the snake, an analogy that is often given in Vedanta. And what the teachers say is, if the snake were real, if the goal is to eliminate that snake, if that snake is real, then the right practice is go get some big stick or a gun and finish off that snake. But if that snake is apparent, if that snake is imagined, if actually it's a rope, you're only imagining it to be a snake, then a stick or a gun is useless. So, and what you need there, the real weapon there, is light. Because you just have to switch on the light and then that snake disappears. And therefore, we must know the right practice. But the right practice can be determined only if we can know what the right problem is, what the problem is. Because, it's pretty obvious really. When you are ill and when you go to a doctor, what medicine the doctor prescribes will depend on what diagnosis the doctor makes. If the diagnosis is wrong and the medicine given is right for that wrong diagnosis, it's not going to cure me. And therefore, a right prescription for a right diagnosis is the way. And so, in this spiritual problem, I must first make the right diagnosis, what the problem is. And if I can do that correctly, then I'll be able to find the right solution to that problem. Verse 65. Aptokting khananam tathopari utkarshanam svikritim nikshepas samapekshate nahi bahi shabdaistu nirgacchati tadvat brahmavidopadesha mananad dhyanadibhirlabhyate maya karya tirohitam swamamalam tatvam na duryuktibhihi. A buried treasure is retrieved not merely by urging it to come out, but through expert advice, digging, removing of the overlaying stones, etc., and grasping it. In the same way, one's pure nature, which is buried under Maya and its effects, is experienced not with bad reasoning, but with practices such as reflection and meditation, after receiving instruction from an enlightened being. Look at that phrase, bad reasoning. In Sanskrit, it's called duryukti. So, reasoning itself is never enough. In fact, the practice of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, the first thing that Jnana Yoga does is it purifies our reasoning. It's not enough to just be very good in logic, because, as they say, what can be proved through reasoning can also be disproved through reasoning. And as I often like to think of, that in a court case, oftentimes there is the prosecution, there is the defense, and there is the evidence. In fact, there is a rule that whatever evidence is unearthed must be made available to both the sides. The prosecution, for instance, cannot just spring a surprise and saying this is the evidence and they have not shared it with the defense. And so what the two sides in any legal encounter are doing, they are just playing with that evidence. And they might have, they do have completely opposite conclusions to draw from that same evidence. The defense is trying to show how their client is innocent, that evidence does not prove that their client is guilty. And the prosecution is showing that same evidence to say, this is the reason the person is guilty. And both are trying to be very logical, very reasonable, and so on. And so, bad reasoning means a reasoning that is predetermined by our own desires and our leanings. And this is something we really have to be very alert about in life. Not just in scriptural matters, because we apply logic and reasoning in many situations, even in our secular settings. Even those amongst us who believe that, I'm a very thoughtful person, I always weigh the pros and cons and then I decide. What research has shown is that majority of the people, they come to conclusion based on more on their emotions than their logic, than their reasoning. And that is, if there is a dilemma about something, if there is some decision we want to take in life, there is some part of us which already comes to this conclusion, like, no, this is right and this is wrong. Or this is what I should do, this is what I shouldn't do. So that decision is actually made right away. And it's very subtle. But then we like to think of ourselves, no, we want to weigh the pros and cons, we want to think. And so then, because that conclusion is already reached at some level in the mind, I then marshal all my logical tools to navigate to the decision that my emotions have already made. And then we fool ourselves with a chronology, thinking that we weighed all the pros and cons to arrive at that decision, although the decision itself was made before. So that's what research has shown. And so that would be a bad reasoning. So can I, as they say, keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out? And so how reasoning is employed in Vedanta is to always hold the Shruti, the Upanishads, which are the philosophical portion of the Vedas. Because they don't have human authorship, they are seen as a revealed text. And so the reasoning, the guide for that reasoning is making sure that the conclusion is in harmony with what the Vedas say, what the Upanishads say. Now we might say, well, what kind of a reasoning is that? You already have, you're guiding your reasoning based on the conclusions or the truths or the principles taught in the Upanishads, in the Vedas. And the answer to that is that it's not necessary to, what the Vedas say is not a set of dogmas or doctrines which you have to believe. What the Vedas are a kind of a map. What we can do is have a kind of a provisional acceptance that this is the map I believe, I have faith, might lead me somewhere. And I can then guide my reasoning along with what the map shows me. Ultimately, the truth or the freedom that comes to me Not simply on believing the Vedas, but actually experiencing the truth. And once I experience that truth myself directly, then the purpose of the Vedas is done. The purpose of all texts is done. So it just becomes a provisional help in our journey towards truth. So that's the role scriptures can play. So they are not useless, but they are not the ultimate in themselves. Just owning a copy of the Vedas and just kind of clutching it tightly around you or worshipping it daily does not guarantee freedom. Ultimately, the freedom will come only through knowledge. Verse 66. Tasmat sarva prayatnena bhava bandha vimuktaye svaireva yatnaf kartavyo rogadau iva panditaihi. The wise should therefore make all efforts on their own, as is done during an illness, to be free from the bondage of the world. On their own, again, is a key phrase here. No one can do it on our behalf. People can prepare food and put it in front of us. But if I have to eat and digest it, that only I can do. I can't say, well, I'm too busy now. Why don't you just eat the food and digest it on my behalf? It doesn't work that way. So spiritual life is also exactly in the same way. So that's the message that comes again and again in this section, that you have to experience the truth, not simply hear about it or read about it, and that can be done only by yourself. That cannot be done through proxy. No one else can do it on your behalf. Verse 67. Yastvayadya kritah prashno variyan shastravinmatah sutra prayo nigudhartho nyatavyascha mumukshubhihi. The question you asked today is excellent, the kind that those proficient in scriptures might ask. It is almost like an aphorism, profound and worthy of being known by seekers of freedom. This is a great praise just for the quality of questions that the student has asked the teacher. Drafting a good question is possible when we know what we do not know. Because then it's easy that the question itself becomes, the question really phrases itself. But if we do not know what we do not know, then it's very difficult to craft a good question. I remember years ago when I was young and I was studying Vedanta under a very renowned Vedanta teacher. He was already in his, how old he must have been then? Yeah, he was in his late 70s at that time. And he was such a remarkable teacher. I remember whenever we would ask him a question, we were studying all these basic Vedanta texts, and the entire teaching was in Sanskrit because he didn't know English, I didn't know his mother tongue, and so the only mode of communication was Sanskrit, which was a great experience. So the interesting thing was, whenever we asked him a question, he would not straight away answer the question. He would actually tell us, that's not a good question. Then he would tell us what would be a good question in that. So he didn't deny that there are portions in the text where questions are possible. But before giving us the answer, he trained us in asking a good question of what would be a reasonable question in this situation. And therefore, whenever we are studying this book, try to look at it calmly, with a focused attention, see what you understand, see what doesn't make sense, ask yourself, why does it not make sense? Dwell on it for a while, and then you will know what you do not know. And then you will know what to ask and how to ask it. And because this student has done it so well that the teacher praises it in this verse, saying it's almost like an aphorism. You see, it's not sometimes when we are not sure of what we don't know, our questions tend to become very long-winded because we are trying to think as we are speaking. But when we know exactly what we don't know, then the question can be very succinct, can be very, very compact. That's why he says it's almost like an aphorism, profound and worthy of being known by seekers of freedom. Next verse. This is the last one we'll do today. Shrunushva vahito vidvan yanmaya samudiryate tadetat shravanat sadyo bhavabandhat vimokshase. O wise one, listen attentively to what I explain to you. You will be immediately freed from the bondage of this world by listening to this. That's a great promise. But we'll have to wait until we meet next time to do that. So we will stop here. And from the next verse, 69, the teacher will begin answering the 7 questions that the student asked earlier. So the question in verse 49, how is freedom attained, will be answered in the verses that follow, which we will do when we meet next time. So if you have any ideas, thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to ask.
Hello, Swamiji. Swamiji, how do we move from hearing or reading texts to experiencing the texts?
Yes, good. So when we read something, the next thing would be to reflect on it. Because when we read something, some meaning does come to us. But then it's good to, as I said, keep that thought revolving inside the mind and reflect on it. It's almost like when you're going to buy a house, for instance, or buy a condo, and you go there, you don't just see it from a distance, okay, I'm buying it. I mean, some people might do that. But most of us, we actually want to go and take a good look how the things are before making, it's a major decision. So understanding any text is also a fairly major decision. Not to jump to conclusion and say, well, now I know what it means. To kind of look at it from different angles. And when you look at it from different angles, the different facets might become revealed. So you reflect on it. And if the meaning is still not clear, then you meditate on it. And then ultimately, it's the I don't know what the technical word nowadays it's used. It's like, what's the action part of it? That yes, this is what the meaning I have received, I reflected on it. What do I do next? And that's where the main essential thing comes. That if all of this thinking, reflecting, meditating has brought me to some understanding and it resonates with me and I feel, yes, this makes sense, then would be, how do I live? How do I make it my own? When I wake up tomorrow morning, what does this insight mean in me living according to it? Does it shape my thinking in some way? Does it shape or modify or improve the way I relate myself to the world and my work? Does it, that's the kind of way we start living it.
Swamiji, following up to just the comment you made, is the goal of the scriptures and understanding the scriptures to purify our heart so that we attain enlightenment? Because in bhakti yoga, in karma yoga, the end of the day, the goal is to purify our heart and make us ready to receive the enlightenment.
Well,
is it the same kind of process?
Absolutely. I mean, if the heart is completely purified, the truth becomes apparent quickly. And that's why, I mean, Swami Vivekananda once famously said that if all the scriptures in the world were lost and only this one teaching remained, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. He said there is still some hope for the world. So absolutely, no matter what spiritual practice we do, ultimately, by purification of heart, I mean, that same idea can be expressed in many different ways, but essentially it is bringing clarity to our perception, clarity to our mind. If we are driving now in a snowstorm or a heavy rain and my windshield is foggy, then it's dangerous to continue that way. But if I find a way to clear the windshield, I know which direction the car is going, then I will reach the destination well. So the mind is the windshield of our life. And if the mind is foggy, and not just foggy, it's like if it's a lot of dust and dirt and all kind of stuff, maybe the picture is getting distorted with all our preconceived ideas and biases and ambitions and fears. I mean, there's a lot of junk on that. And all of these yogas, all of these practices will help kind of remove that. And yes, so ultimately, you could describe the purpose of all yogas as bringing about self-purification. And getting a little bit more specific into it, sometimes people do express it this way, that bhakti yoga brings about purification of our emotions and feelings. Emotions and feelings are great power, but they need to be purified. Similarly, reasoning. Reasoning is a great power, very helpful, but even reasoning needs to be purified. Because people have in history have done terrible things, brought so much hurt and destruction to people, and they, in their mind, they were being very logical about it. So even the reasoning and logic needs to be purified. Similarly, the willpower needs to be purified also, so that I will know exactly when my power of the will, when my will say yes, and when my will should say no. And both Raja Yoga and Karma Yoga deal with the power of the will. Karma Yoga, as the power of the will operates in the external world, and Raja Yoga, how the power of the will appears in the internal world. So all of these primary functions of the mind, the affective, the cognitive, and which is the next one, the cognitive, the power of reasoning, the power of feeling, and the power of the will. All of these powers need to get purified, and the yogas help us do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Swami. When we say that the solution to ignorance is knowledge, can you just talk a little bit about the distinction, when we say knowledge in that context, the distinction between knowledge and enlightenment, assuming that we're talking about two different things? Or?
No, same thing.
Same.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same. Yeah.
That was easy.
Yeah. But I could kind of add a little to that, and that is, again, I think it's maybe just semantics, just language, but getting that knowledge is really being that knowledge. That's the idea. it's not just, when we speak about switching on the light and we give the rope and snake analogy, the light is still an outside thing. So getting a knowledge might sound, the way it gets expressed is like, I don't have knowledge now and I kind of get knowledge. But what is meant by that really is being that knowledge, that I am that light. So try to think about that in that way, that I am right now, I think I am in ignorance and I will get knowledge. That's how we express it. But the truth is that I am knowledge. But, and this is so impossible, that knowledge is now in ignorance and knowledge thinks that I am ignorant. And when ignorance goes, knowledge knows that I am knowledge. And we might say, it's like light. Light has forgotten that it's light, and light thinks I am darkness. Now we might say, that's crazy. A light can never think it's darkness. And precisely, and that's why this whole thing is a craziness. That's what Maya means, that something that is so irrational, something that is so impossible, somehow seems to have become possible. And in that craziness, the light has forgotten its light and it thinks I'm darkness. And that's why, we don't say I am darkness, we are saying I'm in darkness. We don't think I am ignorance, we say I am in ignorance. And when that ignorance is removed, I become aware of the knowledge that I already am. So again, it's just the semantics of the language. Getting knowledge kind of seems like getting something. And so getting and being, they can now hold that together. Yeah. Okay, so we will stop here now and continue next time with the next verse. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. So today is our last in-person event before we go into our winter break. We had originally planned to have the Christmas Eve in person, but through abundance of caution because of the COVID situation, so we have decided that this time it will be best to call it off so we can celebrate Christmas in our own homes, in the safety and comfort in our own homes. So we will have 3 events in this winter break. On Sunday, we will celebrate the birthday of Sharda Devi, Holy Mother. On 1st of January, we will have our annual Kalpataru festival. And on 23rd of January, we will have the birthday of Swami Vivekachudamani. All of these events will be online. So the 2 pujas will be streamed live. The 1st of January function will be over Zoom. And all of you are already on the mailing list, so you will get the appropriate links a couple of days before these events. So in-person event now, we will meet in the first week of February to continue with our Sunday satsangs and the Vivekachudamani discussion. It's possible that before we meet in the first week of February, whatever we have studied in Vivekachudamani up to this point, some of you might already become enlightened and will say, the study of Vivekachudamani is useless now that I have become enlightened. So if I don't see any of you in the February, I'm going to assume you have become enlightened. But please, whenever you get chance in the days and weeks ahead, all of you already have the book, just dip into it, read it, reflect on it, and you will see that the more you keep on reading and reflect, don't just read. Read a little, pause, maybe read a verse and pause and think about it. And only when you have gotten some understanding, then move to the next one. You'll see it's extremely beneficial. It can truly revolutionize our understanding of ourselves and of our understanding of the world. We will truly feel not just that the year is new, that we have become new also. So a new year can be celebrated to the extent we become new ourselves. And so that is something we can try to do in the days and weeks ahead. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.